Hey friends, it's Jaime Alejandro with the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Two quick announcements before we get the ball rolling here. Item number one, be sure to stop by the links in the episode description. I'm trying to do my best to showcase the work of friends of the show, independent creatives, and people who need to get a little bit more attention to the work that they're doing in the independent artistic fields that they're in. So, you're going to find surprises every single week, whether it's a podcast, a new literary project like a novel or a poetry collection, or a new podcast that you haven't heard of. All in all, it's a great place to discover new and independent creatives. Again, thank you for stopping by and listening to the podcast, as well as stopping by artscalling.com and supporting the work that I've been doing for a little while. It really means a lot. Now, with all that ranting out of the way, let's talk about our guest. Today, I'm delighted to be Arts Calling Theodora Ziolkowski. Theodora is the author of the novella On the Rocks and the short story chapbook Mother Tongues. On the Rocks was the winner of the 2018 Next Generation Indie Book Award and is now available as an audiobook. Ziolkowski's debut collection of poems, Ghostlit, is now available. Ziolkowski's work has received support from the Vermont Studio Center, the National Alumni Association at the University of Alabama, and In Print from Houston, Texas. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared in The Writer's Chronicle, Short Fiction, based in England, and Prairie Schooner, among over 60 other literary journals, magazines, anthologies, and exhibits. In the past, Ziolkowski has served as poetry editor for Gulf Coast, fiction editor for Big Fiction, and assistant poetry editor for Black Warrior Review. She holds an MFA from the University of Alabama, where she was honored as a 30 under 30 alum, and a PhD in creative writing and literature from the University of Houston, where she was the recipient of the In Print Marion Barthelme Prize in Creative Writing. Currently, she teaches creative writing as an assistant professor of English at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Now, folks, you're in for a treat. This was an amazing conversation about her collection of poems, Ghostlit, and we really got deep into the granular things in terms of poetry, and I really appreciate that because as much as I continue to learn about poetry, it is still a wonderful mystery to me, and this was one of those illuminating conversations where we just got to dig deep into the perspectives, the personality of each poem, and I had a great time doing that. So I'm very grateful to Theodora for her time, her insights and awesomeness, and please be sure to check out Ghostlit. I'm going to include the link in the episode description. Without further delay, let's give Theodora a call. Hi, Theodora. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm delighted to get to chat with you about Ghostlit, which is your new collection that is should be available now. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And just thank
Wonderful.
you so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear. So before we get into the collection, I want to check in with you and see if we can start at the beginning. Maybe get a sense of where you're from. May I ask where you're from?
Yes, I'm originally from Pennsylvania, from Easton, Pennsylvania. I currently live in Kearney, Nebraska, which is the home of the Sandhill Cranes, is one of our claims to fame. I really love that the cranes all gather here around this time of year. So I live here now. I teach at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. I teach fiction and creative writing there. But yeah, I'm originally from Easton, Pennsylvania. I've lived in Burlington, Vermont, in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Houston, Texas. That was kind of my trajectory prior to coming here. So it's been fun to live in different regions of the country. I've enjoyed
Yeah.
that, and it's definitely impacted my writing.
So, what do you remember about Pennsylvania, like being young in that place?
Um, oh gosh, that's a wonderful question. I love Pennsylvania so much, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues here who are from Pennsylvania. We bond over this collective connection to the state. I'm writing about growing up in Pennsylvania now in my fiction, so I've been thinking about it a lot in a way that, with a distance, that I didn't expect to be writing about Pennsylvania. So that's been a lot of fun for me. But to answer your question, I guess I mean, Easton. I always think of like, what is the place home to? We have the Crayola factory. I mean, that was something I really loved growing up.
That's
Um,
awesome.
We have the steel, yeah, and Easton is close to Allentown and Bethlehem. You know, we have the Steel Stacks Casino became something when I was, in high school. The weather's so different there. When I was living in the South, when I was in Texas and Alabama, I did miss the season. So I've been grateful to end up in a place where, I mean, we definitely have 5 seasons a day in Nebraska. So I think I just associate the seasons, wildlife with Pennsylvania. I was fortunate to have a really book-filled childhood, so I associate that with Pennsylvania as well, and the arts with Pennsylvania. So, and that's just, from my own upbringing. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like there were some core memories, as they say, that started to permeate, and certainly in the collection, I see some of that. But I guess one of the main ones that I recall hearing on a podcast that you were talking about were fairy tales, or at least how they sort
Oh,
of made their way into the psyche or the subconscious, and now they seem to offer a little bit of guidance for you, or kind of like a guiding light. Can you share like what you remember about fairy tales or what struck you about fairy tales, perhaps that led you to defining a style, if you can kind of trace back what that is?
yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, I'll mention one fairy tale that's just always been this kind of touchstone for me. But before I do that, I'll just say in terms of the writing that fairy tales for me always perform. They're this architecture. I can always lean on them to. I always think plot is very difficult. And I know we're talking about ghostlit poems, but I am a narrative poet. Like I do tell stories in my poems. So, and I in fiction, of course, storytelling. But I really have leaned on just the shape that a fairy tale provides as a way to find my way out of the woods, so to speak, in narrative myself. So those have been great for me. The story that was really important to me as a child was Mary's Key. It was in this big no one talks about Mary's Key or Mary's Child, excuse me. No one talks about that one, or I haven't met people who do, but I just I said Mary's Key inadvertently, I think, because there's a key is this kind of central object of that story, and it's one of those stories where a child is forbidden from doing something, and of course they do. And part of that has which doors they're allowed to open, and of course they open the door they're not supposed to, and the rest of the fairy tale falls from there. What happens to that child? But I love, yeah, I just loved. I remember asking my father to read that again and again and again growing up, and I think there's something in us when we're little, that what draws us to whatever story. I think that can become really a central obsession to our thinking and our and or writing down the line.
So do you remember framework and plot being a difficulty for you when you first started writing your own stories proper? Or kind of what, I guess I'm curious what made you say that, like why plot was kind of the thing that might have been a barrier or the thing that solves the problem for you. Do you remember like trying to figure that out when you were an early writer?
Yeah, definitely. Because my first story was about a girl who finds a boy in the ice, and that's all that happened. I mean, so like so much. It was a long story, and so much that was central to it were these images and these the image of the boy in the ice. So I would find all these ways to describe that and describe how she feels and describe all the sensory details, the kind of things that I try to teach, the beginning writers. But the really central missing element is like, so what, or like, what about this boy, or like, why are we here? And so, I mean, that again, I was probably like 13 when I wrote that, but still, I look back to just thinking, I think I was writing similar things to that for a while because I couldn't figure out how to get things to move or shake up. And I've always been image and voice obsessed. So, voice is kind of what helped me in both fiction and poetry to make things move.
Mhm. Right. I was thinking about the collection. Maybe we can just dive in because I think there's so much here to talk about and many directions to unpack with Ghostlit that maybe in your own words you could sort of give us the introduction to Ghostlit and what this wonderful collection is to you, and maybe what you're hoping to bring into the world with it.
Sure. And by the way, just I love the questions. They're wonderful questions. It's really fun to chat with you. So, but yeah, for Ghostlight, these poems, a lot of them, they center around. I mean, I think the heart of the book is about this speaker. It's a central speaker, and her trying to kind of come to terms with a situation that hasn't been good for her. And so it's a book about just baseline a relationship that she's getting away from. I mean, that's kind of the baseline of the book. But around that is, I think, sort of this commentary about emotional abuse and what it can do to the mind and the body and to one's sense of memory. A lot of the poems, there's a series of poems in there that are interspersed in the book that begin with the line "at the memory care center," and those poems have the speaker working with residents at a memory care center and kind of seeing herself in different ways from working with residents at a memory care center. So this speaker grows throughout. Again, it has an arc. The book, she grows from working there. There are poems about mythology as well. Eurydice is maybe so. I mentioned having a touchstone fairy tale earlier. I guess the touchstone myth in here is the Eurydice and Orpheus myth. And I just think the speaker in this poem, in discussing or in trying to figure out why she needs to do what she needs to do, which is to leave this relationship, she looks to all forms of art as a way to kind of see herself in a different light. So she'll look to film, to literature, to working at this care center, to mythology. And so the book is really about, it's pitched, and I helped pitch it as like this book about emotional abuse, emotional trauma, but it's also as much about memory as it is about that.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I first and foremost, I love this collection, and as a a playwright, a fan of narrative, I think it really sort of like tickles that sensibility of just wanting to see that shape come together, and the way that you're able to use these mile markers of mythology or maybe like culture, just really made it so impactful when you actually got to the I mean, I can't even, it of course, like, words fail me in this, but, like, it was almost like an emptying of a body, and you see its contents, and then you put it back together in such a graceful, wonderful way that I just had a wonderful time, like, going through that journey, as painful, as difficult and harrowing as it was. There were touchstones along the way, and of course, you mentioned, Orpheus and Eurydice as sorta like an anchor there, but one of the other ones that stuck out with me was this poem, "Having returned from a trip, I found the lake," and it seemed like
Mhm.
that right there to me is kind of exemplified the entirety of the collection, and I don't know if that was a mile marker for you, but I just kinda wanted to single out that poem as one that really stuck out with me because, like, I found a reading that you did of it for, what was it? Josephine Quarterly, and just listening to it, like, transformed the perspective, and I'm curious, like, maybe if we could talk about anchors of this collection, like, sort of poems that you saw that said, "Okay, this is going to work for my narrative," like, what were the poems within the collection that gave you structure, and what about reading, like, sort of clarified that structure for you?
Yeah, that's such a, I just want to point, I love that description of emptying of the body that you said, that the poems were like,
Uh-huh.
thank you. I mean, I love that. It's generative for me. So thank you.
Yeah.
That's just gorgeous. The poem you just mentioned, having returned for a trip, is kind of, or having returned from the trip, I found the lake. That poem is kind of chilling to me now because I really did, there, part of the narrative of that poem is that the speaker returns from Paris, and a week after having seen Notre Dame Cathedral, and then it's on fire. So that did happen to me. Not every, some the poems are from experience and imagination, so there's a hodgepodge of things, but that part of the poem is true. And but what's chilling is that, and wonderfully chilling is that, you know. You can now walk around, Notre Dame Cathedral again. It's been rebuilt since the year that the Ghostlit is coming out. The cathedral's been rebuilt, so it's kind of neat that that poem gets to come out now, and now that it's accessible again. But yeah, I think I'm really grateful that that poem stood out to you. I think some of the poems stand out to me, the kind of touchstone ones for form too. So there's some other books in this collection that use a similar form that kind of takes up the whole page, which is why something I'm really happy about is this book is very physically a large object. I mean, it's very wide, and because to accommodate for how long some of the lines are and how much they take up the page. And so some other ones in there. There's one that's similar in form to the one you mentioned. There's one about the being on the like it's about crows and being on the honeymoon with the husband, and it's about wolves. It's about all sorts of things. But that one takes up the page too. There's another one about I don't explicitly state this in the poem, but it is inspired by Hurricane Harvey when that hit Houston just really shortly after I moved there from Alabama, and so that's about that experience a little bit, or that's that experience is the container for the poem. But I think I leaned on that form that takes up the page so much for these really, travel centric poems or weather centric or animal centric, these poems that where it's especially chaotic for in the speaker's life, maybe environmentally or climate wise.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a lot of now that you mention it, as I'm thinking about the poems, there was like there were assaults on landscape that weren't just landscape, you know, and I felt like that those visuals sort of kept recurring, and of course I'm glad that you mentioned the animals too, because there were these moments where you made these comparisons that were so stark, but yet when they landed, they really exposed the vulnerability of a woman. Like when you're talking about there was a poem about the crows, and the mother and the husband were talking about, you know, like what the crows were doing, and then you did a lot of this where you kind of turned that on its side, and then it became more internal about, you know, sort of like the disassociation that a woman has to endure. And I guess maybe we can use one of these as an example of um where you went there. Let me move to this other one that was my favorite. It was Eurydice, the seamstress who laced me. Since you spoke about Eurydice, not necessarily about the animals on this one, but maybe you could elaborate on that one in particular and how that one came to be, that particular poem, because it sort of addresses what you're talking about, I think.
Sure, I'm glad. I mean, it's great that that one stood out to you too, because that was one of the first poems I wrote for the book, and that
Okay.
was a poem that I wrote. It was one of the ones where it originally, that poem, just for listeners, that poem is about this dress that's named Eurydice, that is the wedding dress for the speaker. When I read original earlier draft of the poem, it wasn't named Eurydice. I renamed it when I found out what I was doing with this collection, realized that this poem belonged in the collection. So that one was a lot of the poems kind of came later and they all fit together. That one was one that I kind of doctored to fit in. But I think that I was writing this book before I realized I was writing the book in many ways. So that's a poem that's one of the earliest ones, but when I was writing it without realizing it. So yeah, I that one you mentioned, I think trying to think of the word you use, but that sort of dissociation um, that the speaker has throughout. Uh, I think that's kind of encapsulated by this dress being named after this figure that she identifies with. The collection itself kind of folds it. She's you already see as a foil for the speaker sometimes, and so I think that wearing a dress that's named after this figure that she kind of, or the collection, I think obsesses over. I think is kind of an interesting access point. Is I think the first poem in the book that addresses Eurydice directly. So
Mhm. Yeah. There's this beautiful line in that one. It's of course right at the top, a sort of a setup there. The designer replaced her with another cut from a different cloth. The new Eurydice is leaner. What a just sort of self-judgment, you know, and tying into this idea of Eurydice as and I had found this recently as I was revisiting Eurydice. They I guess that Eurydice means judgment as well, which
mhm.
was a beautiful just sort of connection that I was not aware of. But I think you just captured that so well, sort of like the self critical aspect of this relationship and how it's. I mean, at what point does that just become such a harmful thing to constantly be sort of looking inward and challenging your place in a relationship or in an environment? It was incredibly powerful. But maybe
Thank you.
we can elaborate a little bit on this initial pillars of the collection in terms of thematic ideas. Do you feel like you are starting from a place of thematic, you know, I guess questions that you're looking to address, or does that come later for you as you're uncovering what these poems are going to be?
I think that comes later for me. I a lot of the times when I have these poems the themes that I cycle back to, it's because I'm not done with them yet. So I just keep writing them, and there are a lot of the poems I wrote that circulate around these themes didn't make it into the collection because they were performing similar things as other poems. So um, you know, I I did weed out some of the extra ones that I think were perfectly fine poems, but they didn't add to the narrative. So I think, when I'm generating, I just won't be done with something yet, and so I'll go back to it and try to look at it a different way. And then when it comes to making or paginating the book and thinking through, I just ask a lot of questions about how they're interacting with one another, and um, what ones are doing this, what ones are doing that, how does the tone shifting, yeah. So I would love to be as organized as to know what I was doing in the beginning. I think that would be so great. But part of the joy of writing to me is discovering that, which is, I know, not an uncommon thing for writers to say, but I do love the mystery of writing and the kind of, I always think of it is like going into a dark wood and then figuring it
Uh-huh.
out on your way out. And so that figuring it out is what keeps me writing, I think, too. So
Yeah, for sure. And I hope you don't take it the wrong way, but it was like I always feel like, as a writer, when I start with the theme, it's almost like I'm cheating a little bit, and I'm not forcing myself
mhm.
to actually investigate what I have in front of me. So it seems
Yeah.
like you're attacking this in a more organic way, and you're having a conversation with this, right? You're with sort of like what you're generating, and then that sort of feeds you what the next steps are going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, out of just full, to be fully authentic, this book was a version of it was my dissertation, and I remember not knowing what I wanted to do for my just I didn't know. I had all these poems I couldn't figure out, and part of what really helped me is I had a slip of tongue, and I meant to say gaslit, and I said ghostlit, and so saying that they was generative for me writing new poems, and I kind of figured out what I really wanted to attack in the book. And in doing that, I was able to write more and more. So it's just, yeah, I didn't start out with this idea in mind, but
Yeah, yeah.
I always admire if someone knows how to do that. I don't, but yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, I think it perfectly makes sense, sort of like an exercise or a challenge where you begin with that question that you ask yourself, gaslit and ghostlit instead of gaslit, and you're like, what does that mean? Where do you go from there? And it's pure generation, and from that you start to create the container that will house all of the things that you want to talk about or that eventually come to be. But there's so much wonderful imagery, as I mentioned. The idea of the mollusks, and you have a handful of those mentions which are delightful. I'm curious what drew you to that as an image. What can you do with that particular thing, if we could use it as an example in the poetry that allows you to say what you want to say?
Yeah, it's only in these poems do I mention the sea life. I mean, I don't write about sea life normally. I think, I was very lucky to get to spend 5 weeks in Italy before I was really embarking on writing these poems more seriously. And I remember going on that trip. And I've talked to another writer who's had this experience with Italy too, with going on a trip in mind that I'm going to write these things while I'm there, and going there and writing just notes. I just wanted to experience a lot. And I think I took a lot of notes about just things I noticed, whether it was on my plate or like in the water. I just had these really, this image rich, um, you know, list of things from that trip. And I, I can remember feeling disappointed in myself that I didn't come up with something right away. Like I thought I would come back with volumes written from, this Henry Jamesian kind of ideal of like what I do. But I really got to experience that trip and note take a lot. And I think just from my notes, they became these um, recurring images and metaphors. And whenever with animals, I'm always in nature. I'm always even this. Well, the speaker in the book does that too. She
Yeah.
Googles things a lot, and so or I look researches, and I'm always interested in kind of learning these facts. So I think some of those facts kind of come up to the surface in a lot of the poems, and that's just my own private fascination too that I got to use toward my art. But it's not something I like the wolves in here. there's that wolf poem with the crows. I mean, I've written about wolves since I started writing poetry. I'm interested in wolves. That's not didn't surprise me, but the sea life does. I mean, I think it's Italy. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I think that it's, I hadn't considered how much of the collection was almost I don't want to call it a travelogue, but there were elements of that where you were putting us in these places. We have Mount Vesuvius, we have of course Notre Dame, we have, the beaches, and the Italian coast and that sort of thing. Um I just think like they don't feel they feel effortless and don't feel like the writers guild came out, like you were trying to
Yeah.
make up for lost time. But that's a curious thing that happens where like you're just kind of in collection mode, but you feel this urgency to just expel and to generate and to make something of this amazing experience that I imagine you were having. But how were you able to find let me go to this one because speaking of animals, you were talking about there was another poem here that I really, really enjoyed that was delightful. It was, about deer, which again, like, introduced another sort of animal moment. "It's late, your cat is clawing the back seat, and you're afraid your husband will nod off." Very personal, very intimate poem. But of course, two amazing things, and I have to say, cat cameo. You have to have a cat cameo, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
And and the mention of a deer carcass as a really powerful moving image. And I apologize if I'm giving away sort of like the
No.
turns there, but those were the ones that just stuck with me. Maybe we can talk about that one for a moment, just as an example of how to marry these really dark images into the personal. Because I don't know, like, how do you navigate the mood of this presentation in a way that like you're creating this image that is sort of like um makes you jolt a little bit, but at the same time it returns you to an interiority and makes it really approachable. Um Maybe if you could elaborate on something like that.
Sure, sure. And it just occurs to me now when you mentioned like deer and just echoing, earlier you asked about being from Pennsylvania. I think the deer in Pennsylvania, I mean, but, there's so many deer there. And so the poem you mentioned though, there is a later poem where a deer shows up washed on the shore, and that's kind of an East Coast poem. But the poem you mentioned is a very Tuscaloosa, Alabama poem to me. I mean,
Ah,
the atmosphere of that poem is very that the narrative is the speaker and the husband traveling back to the space. And um yeah, I think it's such an excellent question. I'm trying to think how to answer it. I i think for that one, um you know that one was one of the prose poems in the book, so I think it wasn't originally, but once it became a prose poem, I was able to use the form to help me navigate what happens in the poem in many ways. Um, I knew that I wanted this journey to take place, and I knew I wanted to, within that poem, the speaker has this kind of revelatory memory, and then we're back in the present. It's very kind of a cinematic poem, and I think the form helped with that. But when the deer comes out, it's kind of thinking about narrative again. How do you turn something on its head? And the deer is this. It kind of becomes for the poem in the end, that image of it, and it is out of place. Like you don't expect that at all. And I think the surprise came from working through form and just thinking how, um, yeah, how the speaker would. I mean, you have the living cat and then this dead deer. So, like, what's the opposite of a living cat? Is a dead deer by a pool. I mean, that's just kind of what came to me at the time. But yeah, I think that's very much a poem that's atmospheric, like really based on space, and something that did strike me a lot, in at least where I live, specifically in Alabama for a while, was the roadkill was something that I saw a lot of. And this, what was surprised me with as the writer of this poem, and also just as an experience, is seeing sometimes roadkill in really unexpected, or seeing dead animals in very unexpected places. And that's just from traveling just throughout the South. And yeah, so I
yeah,
think that
yeah.
definitely permeates the collection and permeates how I think when I'm driving too. So yeah,
Right, right.
extra careful.
Yeah, and
So,
I have to say, as a Wyomingite, somebody from the state of Wyoming, that is very common, and it is an image that is alluring and lingering and like really painful but beautiful in so many ways. So it's like this wonderful
yeah.
contradiction that you can use to so much effect. So as you mentioned, this was at least the embers of this collection were part of your dissertation, and if we may look at the timeline of working on a project like this, how long did this take, and when do you know that it is in its final stages? Because there's so many moving parts, there's so many elements, and to get something like this ready for production, for publication, I'm curious what it takes to know that you're at the finish line and what that timeline looks like for you.
Yeah. I guess, I mentioned earlier that I didn't know I had all these poems written, but I wasn't sure how they fit together. And then I really ended up writing the bulk of the book. That I had all these kind of poems that preceded the book, and then I ended up writing the bulk of the book all in one song. I had a draft of the book in the summer of 2019, and that was just one of those magical things that sometimes happen where you just have all these ideas and they spill out. And so I had this draft that's nowhere near what this final product looks like or the final collection looks like. But I do attribute that summer as the summer that I kind of just had this voice for the speaker in my head, and was able to just utilize that in a really generative way. But then in terms of, I mean, so much of writing is revision, and that's the real fun for me. I mean, I love all the stages, but revision is just tinkering in a toy shop for hours. I love revision, and so between the book was, I think, accepted in um 20 2024, and so in between that time I was really revising it heavily, sharing it with trusted readers. I do the thing that I have seen others do too, where you print it out and you put it on the floor and you rearrange all the pages, you figure what goes in, what goes out. I mean, I must have done that I don't know how many times. But it always reminds me of the child's game Twister. When you're
Right,
like
right.
on the this is a very like flexible thing. I just
Yeah.
did that a lot with the book, and doing that too is generative. And I always recommend that to students who are putting a collection together, because when you see how the poems interact side by side, you might that might spawn some other idea for some new seed you haven't
Yeah.
hit on yet. Or so yeah, I mean, the book at one point was in three parts. So, as a playwright, I was following the three act,
Right.
or not a playwright, but you would understand as a playwright,
Sure.
the three act sort of structure. But ultimately, it became a four-part book, just with my thinking through the ways that the poems were interacting. So yeah, I don't know how many iterations it had, but I do know that it was unusual to me how again, that saying Ghostlit as a slip of tongue was very helpful and generative to me
Right.
in building the book. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that you have this balance down, it seems, of having a complete sense of the organic, the sort of the freedom to investigate and then shaping it, which, it's yeah, obviously two ends of the spectrum here, but like especially an exercise like putting everything down on the floor and trying to find emotional, intuitive connections rather than structural ones, just leads me to wonder how you define that, how you get closer to that, to figuring out what works for you in that way, where you say, we don't need structure here. We need more intuition. Like, how do you balance that in the process of organizing the collection? Because there's so much tension from one to the other. And I'm curious, like, when is too much tinkering? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. That's such a great question. Gosh, at some point you have to say goodbye to it, right? You can't have it for, because I think sometimes it can be really, it can not do the work service if you're going so hard at the that you undo what you've made. I mean, that's a real danger, I think. So keeping the heart that you have, that beautiful heart that you started with your writing, and but just chiseling away until you have the best version of that heart is the key. So I don't know if I know the answer to that question. I just know that I got to a space where I can't, if I'm going to do anything else with it, I'm going to be making a new book. And so once I feel like I'm reinventing a new project, then that's when I stop. And if I've shown it to enough, if enough eyes have read it, and I don't show my work for a while, until I have a solid draft, if enough eyes have read it, and I I get to the point where I feel like anything I do at this point isn't remaking this thing, then I stop. So because I think, well, if I feel like remaking something, that means I'm ready for a new project too. And so I should probably get on that and let
Right.
this thing breathe without my dissecting it entirely.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess it's a matter, a really hard, difficult matter of drawing lines in the sand for yourself and figuring out like, okay, these are the parameters still, even though it could be interesting or it could be an exciting challenge to keep, iterating and modifying and changing things. But that leads me to just this idea of managing multiple projects, because as I've seen you work in many forms, you enjoy sort of venturing into other narrative mediums. And as you were working on this, what does the writing schedule look like for this particular project or the other many things that you're balancing? Maybe we can talk about, your life as an educator, which I'm sure kind of like butts up against, your creative responsibilities here. But how do you balance the works that you're working on at multiple, yeah, at all at all times?
Yeah. I love that question because I think have adapted my process a lot based on whatever I was doing. So I think in the past I really prided myself on um I am a multi-genre writer. Thus I write all these things simultaneously because I love doing them. And I still, I mean, that's a wonderful thing to do. And that's how I wrote for most of my writing life. Uh, and it wasn't until actually with the last couple of years that I really am committed to sort of working at one thing at a time. Um, and it might just be based on my work life. It might just be how I've evolved as a writer. And maybe I'll go back the other way. But I do primarily write work in long form fiction. Even my stories are are longer in the grand, as far as stories go these days. Um, so I found it really useful to um, just focus on one project. So for example, I mean, in terms of my work life balance or work writing balance, I'm just in my third year at the university here. So I think my first 2 years were figuring out how to do the balance. And I really rely on the summers to get a lot of work done. I think that, and something I try and impart on students too, is even when you're not actively writing with pen to pad or with your fingers to the keys, you're always like, it's like that summer trip in Italy. I used to berate myself for not like writing it down in the way I wanted at the time, but I think I was writing because I was living and experiencing and absorbing, and it was just a sponge for experience. So something I love to do when things are very busy and that I always encourage others to do is I do a lot of, I'm best thinking when I'm active. So I love walking or biking and taking voice memos as I walk or just writing things down along the way. And that is part of my process now. So I just think that all year long I'm writing. But I think the most kind of unique thing lately is that, you know, I my husband and I are expecting a baby in just a couple of weeks, and so once we learned about this, I had this idea for a project, and I committed to writing a certain number of words every day until I had a draft of this fiction manuscript. And so I've done that, and now that I've done that thing, I'll probably never do something like that again. But it was really fun to try. I know I have a lot of friends who do like the word count a day thing. I'm not that person. I just kind of plunge in and will do a lot some days, do notes other days. I've never been as I'm regimented, but not as particular in how I go about things. But I've been really happy with doing the word count a day. It's been fun for me for this time. So I kind of
Yeah.
did a kind of 9 month thing, with the word count. So that's been fun.
Well, of course, first and foremost, congratulations. That's just phenomenal news, and I I'm excited for the next chapter of your life. I think it's going to be a wonderful time of creativity, and it's like adding another propeller or another like engine to the rocket. Right, when you have a child and it's just
Yeah.
like the trajectory is clearly defined and it's so beautiful. So yeah, that's going to be an exciting time. But I got a couple more questions here for you to be mindful of your time. But I'm curious, as the book is making its way out into the world, what are you left with? How are you feeling about the release? And what do you think? I don't want to say like what's left unsaid, but like what are the feelings that you're left with as this part of you goes out into the world?
Yeah, having a book come out is such a unique, wonderful privilege, and I think that um, I feel so distant from it in so many ways that after you go through this, all the different, everything from waiting to hear if it's accepted to then editing it more, and then to, anything along the production line that the author's involved with. I really have become so distant from it. It's now this tangible object that I'm very proud of it. I'm also a little scared of it. And it feels like this mystical thing that I know that in a year's time, I had this with my first book where I felt like, who wrote this? I had this such a like defamiliarization happen with it. I don't quite feel that way yet. I just
Hmm.
feel happy and terrified of it. But I think that um, sooner rather than later, I'll be very just mystified as to how I got to this point with that. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've had that, but I'm always kind of
Yeah.
feel this weird sense of detachment because I'm on to the next thing. Or
Right,
yeah,
right. I completely empathize with that feeling of it's like being like having a foreign, object here, like that is a reflection of who you were. And I was digging out some old plays of mine that are about 15 years old, and I was reading up, and I'm like, "Hey, is there some life in here?" And then I realized, you know what? This is a completely different human being. I have no idea who this person
yeah,
was.
yeah.
Like who talks like that? Who says that? But yeah, I guess for you, I mean, you do have this history of a couple of things published before, and you've been very prolific, as I've said. And if I may ask about Ghostlit, what was a challenge in Ghostlit that was different from your previous challenges? Because the if I believe On the Rocks was the one before this, is that right? Which was a
Mhm.
novella, right? Um, of your publications, was what kind of challenge did this present that you hadn't met in your previous publications as a collection?
I think, yeah, I think couple things. Paginting a poetry collection is just a different beast. So that comes to mind. And just generating for poetry collection, different beast. Than fiction. Um, I think something to the subject matter of the book, I wanted to write in a way that would connect with a lot of people. So I wasn't thinking about readers for a long time. I don't think about readers till way down the line. When I am putting it together and thinking about submitting it, I do start to consider that. I think with this book specifically, I considered that in a way that maybe with On the Rocks, I knew that book is funny. It's about grief, but it's got humor, and the narrator is very self-deprecating. She can hide behind all these screens. But this book, the emotional abuse and trauma involved with emotional abuse is, part of the core that's like thumping along throughout the book. And the speaker's experience is not unique. It's just something that I know this has happened to many people in many different types of relationships. And I think it was very important to me to speak to that in a way that would resonate with people or resonate in the best that I thought it might,
Hmm.
and to no way diminish things either. So I think
Right.
the subject matter was harder for me than other books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would like to add that there is humor in this collection too, even though I think that's
Thank
the
you.
baffling thing about it. There's moments of levity where they kind of let you
Yeah.
breathe a little bit as you go. So just a shout out to the humor in this collection. One last craft thing, because I'm always curious about this. As a craftsperson of poetry, what was the hardest piece in this collection? And how did you fix it with craft? How were you able to rework it? I mean, the most painful creative part of the
Yeah.
collection, I guess I'm curious of.
Oh, that's a great. Well, just first, thank you for mentioning the humor in the collection. I appreciate you noting that because I don't know. I think there's humor in everything I read in some way or other. Leaks through. So thank you. Looking through the table of contents right now, just to see because each poem felt like its own adventure and had its own problems and its own delights and its
Mhm.
own um joys and frustrations. So one of the poems that stands out is the from NPR, The Wife Learns of the Hog Problem in Texas.
Mm.
it's in the third section toward the end. I think that one I rearranged a lot. It stands out because it has all these mini kind of micro narratives within that braid together.
Hmm.
And I think that I remember chiseling a lot out, putting it back in. I again, it's probably the narrative of that film that gave me trouble because I was working with all these, seeing how these different micro narratives would click. And
Hmm.
so I think it had more narratives than were needed initially, and so it was again, um, honing in on which ones mattered or which ones I needed.
Right, right.
Yeah.
With the NPR headlines, you could just go on and on. There's just so much there to mine that I can imagine. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
distillation, of course, is probably the hardest part of that. So,
Yeah.
as we wind down here, I try to kind of get a sense of two things. Of course, managing your life outside of writing, and since you're an educator, I'm curious of what does the what keeps you going? Because I think that we can talk about you as an educator, you as a poet, but overall as a human being, it's a very difficult time to be a creative person because it feels like we are being bombarded with a world that is very much resistant to different voices, different opinions, and it's hard to
Mhm.
find clarity. So I'm curious how you maintain your quality of life in this difficult time, and even if that includes like managing your schoolwork and managing your creative time or personal life, what does that look like for you, and what replenishes you so that you can continue to be the artist
Mhm.
that you want to be?
Yeah, I think that now more than ever we need art. So I think I feel a urgency toward that, even if it feels like there's this friction with it at the same time. All the more reason to create. I think. I mean, I'm motivated by um, difficulties in some ways, to put it lightly, but I'm motivated by that. And so I think, like, from the educator stance, I think my students need this. Like, I think they need to be writing, and so um, it's really one of the things I always carry into my teaching is this enthusiasm, um, for just, every day, if you can just write down one thing, I think it improves their quality of life um, by do I have them do that when they're in the room with me. I make them write, but I also but just imparting that enthusiasm on them, and um, trying to channel that just love of art, I think, and would like, I hope and would like to think, improves how they are in the world and how they are as people, and how they see themselves. So, and then for me, I'm the best teacher I can be when I'm writing. So I think, I had to figure out how to do that when I started my job, but I know that if I weren't writing continually, or if I weren't thinking as a writer, I I wouldn't be as effective as a teacher either.
Mhm.
So I think they go hand in hand. I'm grumpy when I don't write. I just have to,
Yeah,
it's my
yeah.
way to I'm very grumpy. It's my way. I'm not typically a grumpy person. And so I think that it's my way of processing what's going on in the world, and my way of managing. So I always say I'm a greedy writer. Like, I just love it so much, and I
Mhm.
love when that greediness, but this enthusiasm is catching. And so, um, but
Yeah.
yeah, I hope that students take that away. So, yeah.
Oh man, that is a remarkable, uplifting note to end on. And I'm, first and foremost, very grateful for your time. Grateful for your writing. I mean, this is a Ghostlit is a beautifully evocative, devastating, but really true. Like there's such an earnestness here that I was really taken by, and so I want to congratulate you on this release, and of course on your amazing news that you have.
Okay.
But it's really been a blast, and I know we just scratched the surface, but I hope that we get to chat down the road again when you get another one, or whenever. I'll be around, but. Thank you again for this because it was a great work and a great time to chat with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And your questions are just phenomenal. I mean, you make me excited to write. So thank
Oh
you
well,
for,
thank you because
being inspiring.
it inspires me. I mean, I think that one of the great things is just getting to connect with other creatives, and thank you for making my day. So I hope you enjoy your Sunday.
Thank you. You too. Wonderful to see you.
All right, I'll be in touch on the internet. So take care.
Sounds great. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.